Imagine, if you will, the deep chill of a medieval winter. The year is perhaps the 13th century, in a small village tucked away in the rolling countryside of Europe. The harsh reality of a medieval winter was something far removed from what we know today. Imagine yourself stepping back in time to the 12th or 13th century, into a world where the comforts of modern heating, electric light, or readily available food were utterly unknown. The medieval world was one where nature dictated the rhythms of life, and winter was the most formidable of its seasons. It was not simply a stretch of cold days and snow. It was a trial, an ordeal that tested every family, every village, and every soul who faced it. For those who lived in that distant time, survival was not assured, and the approach of winter carried with it both dread and resignation. When the first frosts appeared, people already knew that some of their neighbors, their friends, and perhaps even members of their own household might not see the coming spring. The medieval villagers' relationship with the land was one of dependence and uncertainty. The entire year was a cycle of preparation, and each season brought its labors. Spring was for planting, summer for tending, autumn for harvesting. Every step in this cycle was carried out with winter in mind. For winter was the true test, the final judge of whether the year's efforts were enough. If the harvest was plentiful, hope lingered, but even then, there was no guarantee that the stored grain, salted meat, and dried beans would last until the fields blossomed again. A harsh frost, a heavy snow, a long season of storms, or even something as small as vermin getting into the granary, could tip the balance from survival to hunger. Picture a village as the days grow shorter, the sun setting early in the sky. The fields, once golden with wheat or green with rye, now lay barren, blanketed in frost, livestock huddled in their pens or barns, chewing through what hay was stored for them. Smoke curled from the chimneys of cottages, a signal of life and warmth, but also of the fuel that was being consumed day by day. To the medieval villager, each pile of firewood was a measure of time, a measure of hope. Would it last until the thaw? And if it did not, how many bitter nights lay ahead in the cold? The cold itself was a living force. Houses were built of timber, wattle and daub and thatch, materials that could hold against rain and wind, but never entirely against the deep freeze of winter. Drafts crept in through cracks in the walls, icy air seeped through shutters that never quite fit, and even the thickest blanket could not fully protect against the chill that settled into the bones. Families often shared a single bed or huddled close together on straw mattresses, not out of affection alone, but out of necessity. The warmth of another body could mean the difference between comfort and shivering misery. The dark was another companion of winter. In a world without electricity, light came from fire and candles, both precious and limited. As the days shortened, nights stretched long, oppressive, and seemingly endless. Families would gather around the hearth, not only to keep warm, but because the hearth was the only source of light. Beyond the circle of fires, lay shadows, the unknown, and the silence of a frozen world. For a medieval villager, the night was not merely a time of rest. It was a time of waiting, of listening, of enduring until the sun returned. The crackling of wood, the low murmur of prayer, the occasional howl of a wolf in the distance. These were the sounds of long medieval nights. Hunger was a constant shadow. Even in years of good harvest, food was rationed carefully. Bread was baked from barley or rye, darker and coarser than anything we know today. Thick stews of beans, peas, and root vegetables provided sustenance, and when available, salted pork or fish gave variety. But by midwinter, stores were already diminished. Families grew gaunt, their faces thin and hollow as meals became smaller and less frequent. A loaf of bread might be divided and stretched across many days, and children were often sent to bed with stomachs still aching. In the harshest winters, desperation drove some to seek acorns, tree bark, or whatever wild plants might still be found, though little grew in the frozen earth. Hunger gnawed not only at the body, but at the spirit, casting a heavy weariness over entire villages. Illness thrived in such conditions. With weakened bodies came lowered defenses, and colds, fevers, and infections spread quickly. Pneumonia, influenza-like sicknesses, and simple respiratory infections could become deadly in cold cottages filled with smoke from hearth fires. Healers might offer herbal remedies: willow bark for pain, garlic for strength, thyme for coughs, but these were often little more than gestures of hope. Faith was often the greatest medicine, and prayers to saints were whispered with every cough and every fever. Yet faith could not always prevent loss. Churchyards filled more quickly in winter, and the ringing of bells for funerals was a sound that marked the season as surely as the crow of a rooster marked the dawn. For the elderly, the very young, and the already sick, winter was particularly unforgiving. Infants, wrapped in swaddling cloths, were often too fragile to withstand the bitter cold. Elders, their strength waning, might not endure the long nights. Parents carried the sorrow of burying children, and children the sorrow of burying parents, all within the span of those frozen months. It was a cycle of loss that repeated year after year, to the point where villagers almost expected it, though never with less grief. Death in winter was not a distant possibility. It was an ever-present neighbor. Yet within this harsh reality, there was also resilience. Communities knew that survival depended not just on individual strength, but on mutual support. A neighbor might bring bread to a starving family, even if it meant less for their own. A thatcher might mend a roof heavy with snow to prevent collapse. Families shared warmth and shared stories, binding themselves together in ways that were as vital as food or fire. In the depths of struggle, there was also kindness, small moments of humanity that kept despair at bay. Despite all the suffering, there were sparks of joy and hope. Winter was also the season of Christmas and Epiphany, times when the church was filled with light and song. Feasts, however modest, brought moments of celebration, and children's laughter echoed through villages when snow fell thick, creating a world transformed into wonder. Even in hardship, the human spirit found ways to endure, to celebrate life, and to believe in the promise of spring. The harsh reality of medieval winters, then, was a reality of duality. It was a time of hunger, cold, sickness, and loss, but also of community, faith, resilience, and endurance. For every life lost, another endured. For every night of despair, there was a dawn that brought light. Winter was not merely a test of survival. It was a teacher, one that instilled humility, patience, and an unshakable awareness of the fragility of life. When we look back across the centuries, it is easy to imagine medieval winters as nothing more than endless suffering. But to those who lived them, they were also times of closeness, when families drew tighter together, when stories were told by firelight, when songs were sung against the silence of snow. These moments, though small, gave meaning to endurance. They made survival more than a mere act of clinging to life. They made it a triumph of the human spirit. And so, as you let yourself drift into sleep, imagine the stillness of a medieval winter night. Outside, the wind howls across frozen fields, snow drifts against cottage walls, and the world lies silent beneath a blanket of ice. Inside, a small fire burns low in the hearth, casting soft shadows against the walls. A family huddles close, sharing warmth, sharing breath, sharing life. Hunger lingers, cold presses in, but still they endure, for that is what it was like to face the harsh reality of a medieval winter. It was struggle, it was loss, it was endurance, and above all, it was survival. In the medieval world, food was not simply nourishment, it was the most constant measure of survival. The rhythm of life itself was set by the planting of seeds, the care of fields, and the gathering of harvests. And yet, when winter came, all of that effort was put to the ultimate test. The scarcity of food was not an occasional misfortune, but an expected reality. Even in good years, when the crops had grown tall and barns were filled with hay and grain, the fear lingered that the stores would not last. And in poor years, when storms had ruined the harvest or disease had struck livestock, hunger arrived early and stayed until spring, gnawing at every body and every soul. Imagine a small village in the 14th century. By late autumn, families have filled their storage bins and cellars with what they could gather. Grains of barley and rye are stacked in sacks or wooden barrels. Onions, cabbages, and root vegetables like turnips and parsnips are buried in pits lined with straw to keep them from freezing. Meat, when available, has been salted, smoked, or dried, for fresh meat is a luxury of summer and early autumn. Fish, too, is salted and hung, ready to be eaten on days when the church forbids meat. These provisions must last through months of cold, when the earth gives nothing, when the fields lie bare, and when the only thing to eat is what was prepared before the first frost. But supplies never seemed abundant enough. A poor harvest meant the difference between survival and starvation. If rains had been too heavy in summer, if the sun too weak, if a plague of insects had descended on the fields, the yield would be small. Whole families looked with worry at their storehouses, counting sacks of grain and wheels of cheese, weighing salted meat, and knowing in their hearts that it would not be enough. They rationed carefully, cutting portions smaller with each passing week. Meals that were once hearty became thin and spare. Stews were watered down, bread was baked smaller, and vegetables were stretched to their limits. The body, yearning for sustenance, grew weaker, and hunger became an uninvited guest that never left the table. Bread was the foundation of the medieval diet. Made most often from barley, rye, or oats, it was dark, coarse, and heavy, far from the fluffy loaves of our modern world. Wheat bread was rare and costly, reserved for the wealthy or for holy days. For peasants, the bread that sustained them was dense and filling, but it was also monotonous. In times of shortage, they stretched flour with ground beans, peas, or even sawdust and tree bark to make it last. The bread filled the stomach, but it did not always nourish. In the deepest winters, villagers spoke of famine bread, made from whatever could be found, bitter and unwholesome, but still life, saving in its own way. Alongside bread came pottage, a kind of thick soup or stew that varied with the seasons. In summer and autumn, it could be rich with fresh vegetables, herbs, and sometimes meat. But in winter, it was reduced to little more than peas, beans, or turnips boiled in water, thickened with a handful of grain, and flavored, if fortune allowed, with a scrap of pork fat or a few herbs dried from summer. Families gathered around the pot, dipping in wooden spoons or pieces of bread, each person taking small mouthfuls, each knowing that the pot must stretch to tomorrow and the day after that. Meat was a luxury for the peasant, not a staple. Livestock was too valuable alive, providing milk, wool, eggs, and labor. Chickens might be slaughtered now and then, or a pig in autumn when the cold air could preserve its meat. But in winter, most meat was eaten salted or smoked. A strip of bacon fat could flavor a whole pot of pottage, and bones were boiled again and again until every drop of flavor was drawn out. For those who lived near rivers or coasts, fish offered another option, but it too was salted and dried to survive the winter. Even the wealthy, who could afford greater stores, found their diet repetitive and plain as the months dragged on. Hunger did not arrive suddenly, it crept in slowly. In the early weeks of winter, meals were still filling, though already measured carefully. But as January gave way to February, supplies grew thin. Children asked for more but were given less. Farmers looked into empty sacks and knew there was no more to give. Faces grew pale and gaunt, and energy waned. Work in the fields was impossible in the frozen ground, but even tending animals or gathering firewood became difficult with weakened bodies. The smallest illness became harder to fight when bellies were never full. There was a time of year the medieval people feared most, the hungry gap. This was the stretch between the end of winter stores and the first new crops of spring. It could last weeks, sometimes months, depending on the weather and the year's harvest. It was then that true desperation set in. Families scoured the forests for acorns or chestnuts, soaked and ground to remove bitterness, mixed into flour to stretch bread. Nettles and wild greens, when they began to appear, were a gift from God. Some dug into frozen ground for roots left behind, hoping to find something overlooked in autumn. Others, with nothing left, wasted away. The hungry gap was a phrase spoken with fear, for everyone knew someone who had not survived it. Scarcity of food was not just physical but emotional. The knowledge that stores were dwindling created an atmosphere of anxiety and tension. Mothers looked at their children with worry in their eyes. Fathers sat silently by the hearth counting how many days of grain remained. Quarrels broke out over rations. Neighbors might beg for food, and though compassion urged sharing, survival demanded caution. To give too much could doom one's own family. The balance between charity and necessity was a painful one, and many went to bed with guilt heavy on their hearts. The wealthy fared better, of course. Lords of manors had larger storehouses, filled with grains and meats collected through rents and tithes. But even in castles, the repetition of food was wearying, and feasts grew smaller as winter wore on. The difference was stark. While peasants suffered hunger, nobles rarely starved, yet disease and cold did not spare them, reminding all that winter's hardships crossed social boundaries, even if unevenly. Religion and faith became intertwined with hunger. Fasting was a common practice, required by the church on many days, but for peasants, every day was a fast of necessity. Still, they bore it with faith, believing that endurance was part of God's will, a trial of the body and the spirit. Prayers were said over every meal, no matter how small, and when Christmas or Easter brought a rare feast, the joy was profound, the relief of eating heartily almost indescribable after months of scarcity. Scarcity shaped the rhythm of life, but it also shaped the spirit of those who lived it. People learned to endure monotony, to accept hunger as part of existence, and to cherish small pleasures. A crumb of cheese, a sip of ale, a fresh egg found in winter, these were treasures spoken of with gratitude. The scarcity of food, while harsh, created a resilience and a reverence for survival that defined medieval life. And so, as you drift deeper into the quiet of this story, imagine sitting at a rough wooden table in a dimly lit cottage. Before you lies a bowl of thin pottage, a crust of bread, perhaps a slice of salted fish. You are hungry, and you know you will still be hungry when the bowl is empty, but you eat slowly, savoring each mouthful, for you know it must last. Around you, your family eats in silence, their eyes weary but determined. Outside, the snow lies deep, the earth sleeps beneath frost, and no crops grow. But within the circle of firelight you are alive, you endure, and though the food is scarce, though hunger lingers, you carry on, as countless medieval souls carried on before you. In the medieval world, fire was not simply a comfort, it was life itself. To us, warmth is something we take for granted. We turn a dial, press a switch, and heat fills our homes. But to the men and women of centuries past, fire was the fragile thread that stood between life and death during the long months of winter. The hearth was not just a place of cooking or gathering, it was the heart of the household, a sacred space where warmth was fought for, protected, and cherished. Without it, the cold would creep in relentlessly, seeping into the bones, weakening the body, and slowly claiming those who could not endure. The story of medieval winter survival is, in many ways, the story of fire and its scarcity. Imagine a small peasant cottage built from wattle and daub, its roof thatched with straw, its walls rough and uneven. The wind rattles against it, and snow piles at the door. Inside, the hearth glows faintly, a circle of warmth in an otherwise frigid space. The fire has burned since dawn, carefully tended, never allowed to die. To let it go out would mean hours of difficulty. Flint and steel were slow, and tinder was precious. A cold hearth was a catastrophe. Families went to bed with embers banked in ash, carefully covered so they might still glow in the morning, ready to be coaxed back to flame. And if the fire did die, a neighbor might be asked to share a coal or a burning stick, for no one could live long in the cold without it. Wood was the fuel most desired, but even wood was not always plentiful. In many parts of Europe, forests had been cleared for farmland, and villagers had limited rights to cut timber. Lords controlled the great woods, and peasants might be punished for taking more than they were allowed. As a result, families spent the autumn gathering what they could, fallen branches, brush, and whatever scraps might be found. Children were sent into the woods to collect twigs, women hauled bundles of sticks on their backs, and men cut peat from bogs where trees were scarce. These piles of fuel, carefully stacked, represented survival itself. Every log burned too quickly, every bundle gone too soon, was a day stolen from spring. The hearth fire was not only for warmth, but also for cooking, and so its fuel was stretched thin. A large fire would warm the room well, but it consumed wood too fast. A small fire might keep the embers alive, but left the house cold and damp. Families balanced constantly between these extremes, shivering through nights, but too cautious to burn through their stores. In poorer cottages, smoke filled the room, for chimneys were rare, and the only vent was a small hole in the roof. Walls turned black with soot, lungs grew heavy with smoke, and eyes watered constantly. Yet despite this, the fire was clung to like a sacred guardian, for it kept death at bay. To huddle by the fire was a ritual of winter nights. Parents, children, and even animals pressed close to its glow. The family pig might be brought inside to share warmth, or chickens kept in corners where the heat could reach them. Blankets of wool or patched linen covered shoulders, but it was the fire that gave comfort. Its crackling was a lullaby, its glow a reassurance against the dark. Beyond its light, the world was ice and silence, but within its circle there was life. When the wind screamed outside, when snow covered the windows, when the world seemed frozen solid, the fire whispered of survival. The poor knew fire differently than the wealthy. In the manor house, a great hall might have a central hearth, with a wide chimney to draw the smoke away, and logs burned in greater abundance. Nobles could afford to burn oak or ash, great trunks that lasted long through the night. They might sit wrapped in furs, their hands warmed by flames while servants stoked the fire endlessly. Yet even in castles, the rooms beyond the hall were often cold. Stone walls held in the chill, and only the wealthiest had chambers with fireplaces of their own. To step away from the hearth was to feel the bite of winter instantly, even in grand homes. And so, in this way, the noble and the peasant alike understood the centrality of fire, even if they experienced it differently. The symbolism of fire carried spiritual weight as well. The church itself was lit by candles and torches, its holy warmth a reminder of divine presence. In the dead of winter, when hunger and sickness loomed, The flickering of candlelight during a Christmas Mass could stir the soul with hope. Fire became a symbol of God's mercy, of the fragile but enduring spark of human life in a dark world. In villages, families sometimes spoke of their hearth as sacred, a place where generations had sat, where prayers were whispered, where children were born, and elders had taken their last breaths. To keep the fire alive was to keep the family alive, not only in body but in spirit. Scarcity of fuel brought deep hardship. There were winters when wood piles ran out, when families burned straw, reeds, or dried dung to keep some semblance of warmth. These fires smoked heavily, burned quickly, and gave little comfort, but they were better than nothing. In desperation, furniture might be broken for kindling, or neighbors quarreled over fallen branches in the woods. The right to gather wood, once taken lightly, became the difference between life and death. Fights, thefts, and even punishments from lords arose when scarcity grew severe. Yet still, people clung to any source of flame, no matter how small. The cold was merciless without fire. Frost crept inside cottages, coating walls and window frames. Water froze in buckets left indoors, and breath hung heavy in the air. Fingers grew numb, and tasks like spinning wool or mending clothes became painful. Babies swaddled tightly still shivered, elders coughed in the icy air, and even animals suffered in barns without warmth. Cold stole sleep, forcing people to huddle together, restless and uncomfortable. In the dark hours, the sound of the wind outside seemed like a predator, reminding all within that nature was stronger than they were. Without fire, no one could endure it for long, and yet, for all its fragility, fire gave not just warmth but comfort, companionship, and even beauty. Families watched the flames and saw shapes in them, told stories by their light, whispered legends passed down through generations. The fire was an eternal listener, the silent witness to laughter, grief, prayer, and song. It was the backdrop to every moment of survival. When food was scarce, fire made even thin gruel edible. When nights were endless, its light gave courage. When sickness struck, it was believed that warmth could sometimes draw out fever, and so the patient was kept as near the flames as possible. There was something profoundly communal about fire. In villages, bonfires might be lit during festivals, even in winter, bringing people together for warmth and celebration. At Yuletide, the great Yule log burned, sometimes for days, symbolizing continuity and the promise of the returning sun. Around these fires, songs were sung, stories told, and hope renewed. Fire was not only survival, but a reminder that spring would come again, that the wheel of the seasons always turned. For children, the hearth was a place of wonder. They stared into its dancing flames, felt the first lessons of awe, and listened to their elders speak of the necessity of tending it. They learned early how to stir embers, how to feed logs carefully, how to respect the flame as both dangerous and sacred. In every medieval home, teaching a child to keep the fire alive was teaching them how to keep their family alive. And so the story of medieval winters is bound inseparably with the story of fire. It was never taken for granted, never wasted, never ignored. It was watched carefully, coaxed, fed, and revered. The scarcity of warmth shaped not only the daily routines of villagers but their very outlook on life. Fire was the difference between hope and despair, life and death, darkness and light. As you drift now into rest, imagine that ancient cottage once more. The snow presses against the walls, the wind howls in the distance, but here by the hearth there is a glow. You sit close, feeling the heat on your face, the rest of your body wrapped in wool and straw. The logs crackle softly, sparks rise and vanish, shadows dance gently on the walls. Around you, your family breathes slowly, their faces softened by the warmth. Outside is a frozen, endless night, but within this circle of light you are alive and you are safe. Fire has carried you through another day, another night, another step closer to spring, and so you close your eyes, listening to the gentle crackle, letting the warmth seep into your bones, carrying you into dreams. Illness in the medieval winter was as familiar as the frost on the fields and the ice on the rivers. It was not an exception, but a part of life, a presence that came quietly into cottages when the days grew short and the nights long. In the months when food was scarce and warmth was difficult to keep, the human body weakened, and weakness left it open to every ailment. In those dark weeks, when the church bells rang more often for the dead than for the living, people came to expect that sickness would visit, though they never knew who it would claim or how long it would stay. To survive a winter was to escape hunger, yes, but also to avoid the illnesses that grew stronger when the body grew weaker. Picture a village in the deep chill of January. Families sit huddled close to the hearth, their breath visible even inside, their bodies pressed together for warmth. The air is heavy with smoke, for chimneys are crude and windows small, and fresh air seldom enters. In such close quarters, one child's cough becomes the cough of a mother, then a father, then a neighbor. A fever that strikes one home may soon strike the whole village. In an age without knowledge of germs, people believed that sickness came with foul air, with bad spirits, with the wrath of God. They could not see the invisible causes, but they knew its signs: the flush of a fever, the rattle of a chest, the weakness in the limbs, the loss of appetite that marked the beginning of decline. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and other winter illnesses were deadly. A simple chill, left untreated, could settle into the lungs and end a life within days. Parents watched helplessly as children grew weaker, their small bodies unable to fight the sickness. The elderly, too, were vulnerable. Their strength, already fading, could not withstand the long assault of cold air and coughing nights. Even strong adults could be struck down quickly, their bodies too drained by hunger and fatigue to resist. And yet, despite the sadness, this was part of the rhythm of life, a rhythm that repeated every year. Healers offered what remedies they could. Herbs gathered in summer were dried and stored for winter use. Thyme for coughs, honey for sore throats, garlic for strength, mint to soothe the stomach. These remedies provided some comfort, but they were rarely cures. Sometimes warm poultices were laid against the chest, or steam from boiling herbs was inhaled to clear the lungs. If the sickness passed, families thanked God for mercy. If it did not, they turned to prayer, to charms, and finally to burial. Death in winter was so common that people half expected it, yet each loss was no less painful. The sound of church bells tolling across the snowy fields became the music of the season. Winter illnesses were not only of the body, but of the mind. Darkness weighed heavily on the spirit. With days so short, nights so long, and outdoor work reduced by the frozen earth, people found themselves enclosed, restless, and anxious. Melancholy was common, though it had no name as we understand it today. The mind wandered to fears, to memories of loved ones already lost, to the uncertainty of whether there would be enough food or whether spring would ever come. Despair itself was a kind of illness, a shadow that stole strength and made survival harder. Faith was the balm for many, the belief that hardship was part of God's trial, that endurance would be rewarded, and that the dead had simply gone to a better place. The spread of disease was made worse by scarcity. Malnourished bodies could not fight infection. A child who had eaten only thin broth for weeks had little resistance when fever came. A mother who shared her food to keep her children alive weakened herself until illness claimed her. A father who worked in the cold with little sustenance was easily struck down by sickness. Hunger and illness wove together, each feeding the other, each magnifying the toll of winter. And yet, even in illness, there was community. Neighbors tended to one another, bringing bowls of hot pottage to the sick, or watching children when parents were bedridden. The local priest came to administer last rites, his presence both solemn and comforting. Sometimes whole households were stricken, and the village carried the burden together, helping to dig graves in frozen ground or share what little food could be spared. The bonds of community were tested each winter, but they were also strengthened. For in the face of sickness and death, people leaned on one another, finding solace in shared suffering. The wealthy endured illness differently, though not entirely spared. In castles, fires burned larger, food was more plentiful, and doctors trained in humoral theory offered treatments, bleeding, purging, or elaborate herbal concoctions. Yet winter cold seeped into stone halls just as it did into cottages, and sickness spread just as easily among servants, courtiers, and lords. The difference was only that the wealthy had more comfort in their illness, softer beds, and warmer furs. Death, however, came to all. In many ways, the winter illnesses were great equalizers, reminding peasant and noble alike of the fragility of life. The rituals of death itself were shaped by the season. Digging graves in frozen earth was laborious, and sometimes the dead were kept in simple wooden shelters until the ground softened enough for burial. Funerals were cold affairs, with mourners stamping their feet in the snow, their breath rising in clouds as prayers were spoken. The churchyard filled steadily in winter, crosses marking fresh mounds, each one a reminder to the living of the precariousness of their own survival. And yet, even amidst sorrow, funerals were moments of unity when the village gathered together, shared grief, and renewed their faith that spring would eventually bring new life. Superstition, too, surrounded illness. Some believed fevers were sent by spirits, or that sickness spread through the evil eye. Charms were worn, prayers muttered, and relics of saints touched in hopes of protection. Holy water was sprinkled on the sick, and candles burned at church altars to beg for healing. Though medicine was limited, belief itself was powerful. Faith gave hope when herbs failed, and rituals gave structure to grief when cures could not be found. The cycle of illness and mortality became part of the rhythm of medieval life, so much so that people grew accustomed to loss in ways that might seem unimaginable today. Children often grew up seeing siblings die young, and adults buried parents, spouses, and neighbors with regularity. Yet this familiarity with death also gave a different perspective. Life was seen as fragile and fleeting, but also as part of a larger journey. The body might fail in winter, but the soul, it was believed, endured forever. Still, for those who survived, illness left scars. Bodies grew weaker, and those who recovered often carried lingering coughs, stiff joints, or lasting fatigue. Survivors of harsh winters bore the memory of sickness, not only in their minds, but in their very flesh. Yet they also carried pride, for survival was proof of resilience, a badge of endurance in a world that tested them constantly. As you listen to this story and feel yourself slipping into rest, imagine once more the medieval winter. The snow falls silently outside, the air inside is heavy with smoke, and a child coughs softly in the corner. The mother holds the child close, whispering prayers, while the father feeds the fire with his last bundle of sticks. In the darkness, fear lingers, fear of illness, fear of loss, but so too does hope. For every sickness that came, some survived. For every life taken, another endured. And for every winter of sorrow, spring followed with warmth, with light, with healing. This was the reality of illness and mortality in the medieval winter. It was relentless, it was familiar, and it was inescapable. But it was also met with courage, with faith, with the quiet determination of people who faced each day, never certain it would be their last, yet always holding on to the fragile spark of life. And now, as the story fades and your eyes grow heavy, let the quiet truth remain. Even in the harshest winters, even amidst sickness and sorrow, there was survival, there was endurance, and there was always, always the promise of spring. In the long winters of the medieval world, When hunger gnawed and sickness lingered, the thing that most often held people together was not their food stores or their firewood, but their community. Alone, a family might falter. Alone, a widow or a sickly child could easily perish. But together, bound by necessity and by custom, villages became something more than collections of cottages scattered across frozen fields. They became small fortresses of resilience, each person contributing, each household depending on the other. In the dark, when the night stretched for what felt like forever, and the wolves cried at the edges of the forest, it was not only the hearth fire that kept the chill at bay, but also the presence of neighbors, the comfort of knowing that one was not alone in the struggle for survival. Imagine the heart of such a village, snow piled thick upon the thatched roofs, the paths between homes half hidden beneath drifts. Smoke curls from chimneys, thin lines of gray against a pale sky, and within each home the sound of voices rises, sometimes in song, sometimes in prayer, sometimes in whispered worry. The doors are simple wooden planks, the windows shuttered against the wind, yet inside each cottage lives not just a family, but a sense of belonging to something greater. For though food is scarce and warmth fleeting, the knowledge that others endure the same hardships brings a strange kind of solace. Misery shared is halved, just as joy shared is doubled. On the coldest nights, neighbors might gather together. One household perhaps has managed to keep a larger fire, and they invite others in. They share bowls of thin pottage, pass around crusts of bread, and tell stories while the flames flicker. The stories may be old legends, tales of saints, or simple recollections of summers past, when fields were green and the sun long. The children cluster at the edges, their eyes wide, their cheeks flushed from the heat of the fire. The old ones sit with blankets around their shoulders, nodding slowly, adding a comment here and there, correcting details, ensuring the past is not forgotten. In this way, memory itself becomes a kind of warmth, a shared treasure more valuable than salt or grain. Helping one another was not optional, it was survival. If one man fell ill, his neighbor might tend his animals. If a woman lost her husband, the village would see that she and her children had some food. If a house collapsed under heavy snow, others would help repair it. These acts of kindness were not thought of as charity in the way we think of it today, but as the natural order of things. Everyone knew that misfortune could strike any household, and the one who gave today might be the one who needed tomorrow. It was a cycle like the seasons themselves, binding people together in dependence and generosity. In times of death, which winter often brought, the community gathered for burial. Men broke the frozen earth together, women prepared the body with prayers and cloth, and children walked behind, learning even in grief that no one was ever truly abandoned. Mourning was shared, food was shared afterward, tears were shared too. There was no hiding from suffering, and so suffering was embraced collectively, carried together so that no single family bore the full weight of it. Festivals in winter also strengthened bonds. Though resources were scarce, Christmas, Epiphany, and Candlemas were marked with rituals, small feasts, and gatherings. The church bells rang, candles glowed in the dim interiors, and villagers sang hymns that echoed against the cold stones. Even if the feast was meager, even if the bread was hard and the ale watered down, the joy of coming together for worship and celebration offered relief from the monotony of hunger and cold. For a night, people could remember warmth, laughter, and abundance. These occasions gave the spirit strength, and strength of spirit often meant strength of body. At the heart of resilience was the sharing of knowledge. Elders passed down wisdom on how to store food best, how to stretch a sack of grain through a lean month, how to keep a fire smoldering through the night without wasting wood. Mothers taught daughters which herbs eased coughs, and fathers taught sons how to repair tools with almost nothing. This transfer of knowledge was an inheritance more lasting than coin, a survival guide etched not in books, but in memory and in practice. Each generation built upon the endurance of the last, learning from their failures and cherishing the small victories that allowed them to live through the harsh season. It was not only knowledge of survival that was shared, but also faith. The church was central, and its doors rarely closed, even in the deepest cold. People came together to pray for the sick, to ask blessings for livestock, to plead for a swift spring. Belief was a glue that held the frayed edges of existence together. The notion that suffering was part of God's plan made hardship bearable. The priest reminded them that Christ himself knew cold, hunger, and pain, and that their trials brought them closer to the divine. Such words may not have filled empty bellies, but they filled hearts with a kind of strength that hunger alone could not destroy. Music and storytelling also played their part. A fiddler might strike up a tune in a warm cottage, or a singer lift a voice in plainchant that drifted into the rafters. Children learned rhymes, riddles, and songs, repeating them until laughter broke through the gloom. These moments of levity were not frivolous but necessary. In a world where death was close at hand, joy became an act of defiance, a flame against the darkness. To laugh in winter, to sing when the body was weary, was to affirm life itself. One of the greatest sources of resilience lay in the rhythm of work. Even in winter, when fields lay fallow and earth was hard, tasks remained. Wood needed chopping, tools mending, nets repairing, and animals tending. Men trudged through snow to gather fodder. Women spun wool or patched garments, and children carried water from half-frozen streams. These tasks, though difficult, gave structure to days that might otherwise have been filled with despair. Work reminded people that time was still moving, that spring would come again, and that they had a part to play in reaching it. The bond between humans and animals was also crucial. A cow that survived the winter meant milk in spring. Chickens offered eggs, sheep gave wool. Families sometimes slept in the same space as their animals, not just for protection, but for warmth. The breath of livestock, the sound of their steady chewing, was comforting, a sign of life and continuity. Villagers cared for their animals with devotion, for the survival of beasts was tied to their own. And in this care, they found another form of resilience, a reminder that survival was a shared effort between species, not just among humans. Even when disaster struck, a roof collapse, a sudden fire, a raid by wolves, the instinct was to rally together. Neighbors formed chains to pass water, rebuilt structures with shared tools, and chased predators away with torches and shouts. No one expected to face calamity alone. To live in a village was to live as part of a body, each member connected, each limb protecting the others. A hand might be small, but it was essential. So too was every villager, no matter how humble. Children learned resilience from the moment they could walk. They saw their parents endure, saw their grandparents endure, and absorbed the lesson that endurance was the measure of life. They learned that crying did not fill bellies, but work and patience might. They learned to carry small loads of wood, to patch clothing with clumsy stitches, to care for siblings. Childhood was short, yet it was through these early trials that the spirit of resilience was passed on. And when they grew older, they repeated the cycle, teaching their own children in turn. The poor, the widowed, the infirm, all had a place within the community. While life was harsh, exclusion meant death, and so even those unable to contribute fully were woven into the fabric of village life. A widow might not plow fields, but she might tell stories that lifted hearts. An elder might no longer chop wood, but he might know the prayers to ward off sickness, or the songs that eased fear. Every role mattered, every life had meaning, and together they created a net strong enough to catch those who might otherwise fall. As the long winter wore on, with its endless gray skies and its biting winds, resilience took many forms. It was the patience of a mother stretching the last of the grain into a thin porridge. It was the father who worked through fever to repair a roof. It was the child who shared a crust of bread with a hungry sibling instead of keeping it for themselves. It was the neighbor who checked on another, the priest who walked through snow to comfort the grieving, the elder who whispered encouragement when hope seemed lost. Spring, when it finally came, was not just a change of season, but a reward for endurance. The thawing of snow, the trickle of streams, the first green shoots, these were not just natural events, but sacred confirmations that their struggle had not been in vain. Communities emerged from winter with scars, yes, but also with pride. They had survived together. They had faced hunger, illness, and sorrow, and still life went on. The children who survived carried forward the songs, the stories, and the lessons of resilience, preparing to endure winters of their own. This was what community meant in the medieval winter. It was not merely an idea, but a necessity. It was food shared, burdens carried, sorrows eased, joys multiplied. It was the simple truth that survival was not an individual act, but a collective one. The village was the shield, the hearth, the extended family, the living reminder that no matter how harsh the season, no matter how close death came, no one had to face it entirely alone. And so, as you let these words settle and your eyes grow heavy, imagine yourself in that small medieval village. Hear the crackle of the fire, the murmur of voices sharing stories, the laughter of children despite the cold. Feel the warmth of community surrounding you, as strong as any blanket, as vital as any meal. Know that in that world, as in our own, resilience was not found in solitude, but in togetherness. And with that knowledge, drift into rest, held by the same timeless truth, that survival is strongest when shared. The medieval mind saw the world not only as something to be endured, but as something filled with symbols, signs, and divine meanings, especially in the hardest season of all, winter. To them, winter was never simply a time of cold and hunger, never merely a shift in weather or the tilting of the earth. It was a spiritual season, a mirror of the soul, a lesson written into the rhythm of creation by the hand of God. To look out upon the barren fields, the silent woods, and the long nights was to see reflected truths about life, about death, and about the mysterious path of the human heart. The medieval man and woman could not separate the natural from the divine, and so winter was never merely endured, but interpreted, pondered, feared, and revered. When snow covered the land, erasing boundaries and softening even the harshest features of the earth, it was seen as a reminder of mortality. Just as the flowers fell away and the harvest was stripped, so too did human life pass swiftly. The whiteness of snow, pure and cold, was likened to the burial shroud, covering all things without distinction, rich and poor, young and old, noble and peasant alike. To walk in a snow-covered field was to be reminded that all flesh returns to dust, that the glories of autumn fade, and that one day every life, however vibrant, will meet its quiet winter. Such meditations were not morbid but natural to the medieval soul, for death was ever near, and winter made it undeniable. Yet, just as death was remembered in winter, so too was hope. Beneath the frozen ground, seeds lay hidden, unseen but not destroyed. The medieval mind saw in this a reflection of the resurrection. Though life appeared extinguished, though all seemed barren, yet in time new life would emerge. This mystery was preached by priests and sung in chants, but it was also lived and experienced in every passing year. To endure winter was to enact a small drama of death and rebirth, of sorrow and consolation, of Good Friday and Easter morning. Each cycle of seasons taught anew the promise that suffering was not the end, that darkness gave way to light, that beneath the silence of snow there lay a pulse waiting to rise. Winter nights, long and profound, were also times of deep psychological meaning. With no clocks to measure hours precisely, with candles costly and firewood precious, people lived by the natural rhythm of darkness. They lay in bed through the endless hours, not always sleeping, but drifting in and out of half dream, half thought. In these intervals of wakefulness, they prayed, they pondered, they remembered. Some spoke of first sleep and second sleep, divided by a waking period in the middle of the night. In those hours, the veil between worlds seemed thin. Dreams mingled with reality, ancestors seemed near, and the presence of God was felt more strongly in the silence. Winter encouraged such inwardness. It drew people into themselves, forced them to reckon with their thoughts, their sins, their longings. The medieval mind, so attuned to the spiritual, found in these nights not only discomfort, but a kind of revelation, an invitation to contemplation. The cold itself bore meaning. The biting wind on one's face, the ache of fingers stiffening, the sight of breath rising in the air, all of it was a reminder of human frailty. Warmth had to be sought, fire had to be tended, and without vigilance, life could slip away. To feel such cold was to know one's dependence, not only on neighbors and family, but on God Himself. Cold humbled the proud, for no strength of will could command the frost to cease. Only patience, prayer, and endurance could see one through. And so the cold became almost a teacher, instructing in humility, in perseverance, in the acceptance of limits. Just as monks mortified the flesh to purify the spirit, so too did winter mortify the world, stripping away abundance and luxury until only what was essential remained. Silence, too, was part of winter's meaning. In summer, the fields rang with work, in autumn with the noise of harvest, but in winter the land fell quiet. Snow muffled sound, birds migrated or grew still, and the forest seemed hushed. For the medieval soul, accustomed to interpreting every sign, this silence was not empty but filled with presence. It was the silence of waiting, of preparation, of listening. Priests likened it to the stillness before Christ's birth, the hush of creation before the miracle of life. Ordinary people, though less learned, felt it as a sacred pause, a time when God spoke more softly, and one had to still the heart to hear. In villages, winter also carried the meaning of testing. Just as the soul was tested by temptation, so the body was tested by hunger, and the community tested by hardship. To survive winter was to prove faithfulness, resilience, and unity. Each family knew that the season would reveal their character, just as fire reveals the nature of metal. And in surviving together, in facing scarcity with courage, they felt they were enacting a divine lesson. Life was not ease but endurance, not plenty but perseverance, and winter inscribed this lesson deeply. Legends and tales grew around winter nights, giving shape to fears and hopes. The long hours invited stories of spirits that walked in snow, of saints who braved cold to bring warmth to the poor, of angels who guarded sleeping children. Some tales warned of demons or the wild hunt, sweeping through the sky, carrying souls away. Others told of miraculous lights, of Christ appearing in humble guise to test hospitality. These stories were not entertainment alone, but reflections of the inner meanings felt in winter's presence. That unseen forces moved through the darkness, that every act of kindness might echo into eternity, and that life was always poised between peril and grace. The church calendar deepened these meanings. Advent fell in the darkest weeks, calling people to penance and expectation. They waited in cold and darkness for the coming of light. At Christmas, the birth of Christ was celebrated precisely when the sun began to return, when days grew imperceptibly longer. It was no accident that the feast of light was placed amid winter's depth. Candlemas followed, with candles blessed to ward off the gloom, a symbol of light carried into homes still shadowed by cold. Each feast was more than ritual, it was a psychological anchor, a reassurance that darkness did not last forever. On a more personal level, winter became a mirror of the inner life. Those struggling with despair saw their sorrow reflected in the barren fields. Those clinging to faith saw in the persistence of seeds beneath snow a sign of hidden grace. Winter gave form to feelings otherwise inexpressible. It provided imagery for prayers, metaphors for sermons, language for the soul. To say that one's heart was cold, or that one awaited the spring of God's mercy, was not poetic flourish but lived reality. Even hunger carried spiritual significance. To feel one's belly empty was to share in the fasting of monks, in the trials of saints, in the suffering of Christ. The medieval mind saw virtue in endurance, holiness in patience. The body's deprivation was often understood as the soul's sharpening, and while no peasant rejoiced at famine, many drew strength from the belief that their hunger was not meaningless but joined to a larger story of trial and redemption. The stars above, sharp and bright in the frozen air, also carried meanings. To gaze upward on a winter's night was to see eternity more clearly. The heavens seemed nearer when the world below was hushed. Astrologers read signs in the constellations, priests reminded the faithful of divine order, and common folk simply felt awe at the majesty of a sky unsullied by smoke or torchlight. Winter nights thus stretched not only time but imagination, opening the soul to vastness, to mystery, to God's grandeur written in the firmament. Dreams too took on weight in winter. With long nights and broken sleep, dreams multiplied, lingered, and were pondered. Some sought meaning in them, believing they carried messages, warnings, or comfort. A dream of green fields might be taken as a promise of spring. A dream of fire might mean warmth and safety. Others saw dreams as temptations, tricks of the devil. Yet in either case, winter gave them room to flourish, gave people space to turn inward, to listen to the murmurings of the unconscious. Children, though less burdened with interpretation, absorbed these meanings in stories, prayers, and rituals. For them, winter was both frightening and magical. The shadows seemed longer, the nights endless, yet the joy of feasts and candles shone brighter against that backdrop. They learned early that hardship and wonder walked side by side. And so, from childhood onward, winter imprinted itself on the psyche, shaping a view in which darkness was never without light, suffering never without meaning. In this way, winter was not simply endured, but woven into the medieval imagination as a teacher, a prophet, a mirror. It spoke of mortality, yet promised renewal. It humbled, yet lifted hearts to God. It silenced the earth, yet filled the soul with contemplation. Every frost, every snow, every long night was a lesson, a parable written in nature, telling of the eternal truths that guided human life. And though centuries have passed, though we no longer fear the cold as our ancestors did, still the echoes of that meaning remain. For winter, in all ages, draws us inward, strips away distractions, and invites us to reflect on what endures when all else is bare. And so, as you rest, imagine yourself in that medieval world where every snowflake was a sermon, every star a sign, every night an invitation to wonder. Feel the hush of the land, the cold pressing gently against the walls, the fire flickering in the hearth. Let the silence settle, not as emptiness but as fullness. Let winter's meaning unfold within you, as it did for countless generations before, reminding you that darkness is never the end, that beneath the snow life waits, and that every season, no matter how harsh, carries within it the promise of renewal.